My name is Julia Merrick, and I'm 34 years old. The night my mother introduced me to a room full of strangers as her other daughter, the one who cleans houses, I was sitting with my grandmother's brass key folded inside a linen napkin on my lap. My mom said it like an apology she was proud of. My sister laughed and added that our dad had given up on me years ago. What none of them knew, what my whole family had no idea of, was that the most powerful woman at that table already knew exactly who I was. And what happened in the next 90 seconds took every drop of color out of my mother's face. Welcome back to Wise Family Revenge, where we sit with the women who got quietly counted out and watch them find their spine. If a family that edits you down has ever made you doubt your own worth, you belong here. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. To understand that dinner, you have to see the one a year before it. My sister Vanessa had just finished her marketing certification, and my mother threw a party like she'd cured something. Sharon Merrick knows how to fill a room with the right words. She toasted Vanessa's real career 3 times before the appetizers were gone. She introduced her to every neighbor by name and title. When Mr. Halloran from 2 doors down turned to me and asked what I did for work, I watched my mother's smile tighten at the corners. She got there before I could. "Oh, Julia's in services," she said, waving her wine like she was clearing smoke. "She keeps busy. You know how she is." Mr. Halloran nodded politely and drifted off. And that was that. I was in services. I kept busy. I was a sentence my mother knew how to end quickly. I didn't correct her. I never did. I told myself I was keeping the peace, that a good daughter lets the small things go, that love sometimes looks like swallowing. I stood by the cheese plate and I let her spell me however she wanted. My hands under the table of that party were the same hands that had signed payroll for 80-some people that Friday. Nobody in that house knew it. Nobody asked. I drove the 2 hours home that night and told myself it didn't sting, which is the biggest lie I keep in stock. Keeping the peace felt like being loved. It took me 10 years to learn those are not the same thing. But that party was just the warm-up. The dinner was where it all came apart. Here's the part my family left out of the story they told about me. At 5 in the morning, while that town was still dark, I was already somewhere I mattered. That particular morning, I was walking the 4th floor of a hospital with my East Side supervisor, Marcus, checking the surgical wing before the day shift arrived. The floors were so clean they looked wet. They weren't. That's the whole trick. Clean enough to look like water, and dry enough to walk on. A night nurse named Priya passed us with an armful of charts and said, "Morning, Julia. Whatever your crew did to the OR corridor, keep doing it." She said it like she meant it, because she did. I built a company called Meridian Facility Services. We don't do houses. We do hospitals, food processing plants, a couple of data centers where a speck of dust can cost more than my first car. A few dozen crews. An 8-figure name on the contracts. I started it with a mop and a used van and a grandmother who believed me. What I never did was bring any of it home. I kept that world sealed off in a separate drawer, away from my mother, because every time I'd cracked the drawer open before, she'd looked inside and found something to be embarrassed about. So I stopped showing her. 2 hours south of that hospital, I was nobody. 2 floors up in that hospital, a surgeon knew my name. I'd made my peace with the split. Or I thought I had. What I hadn't figured out yet was why I kept driving south at all. Why I kept knocking on a door that only opened for a version of me that didn't exist. The invitation came by phone, the way all my mother's summons did. Vanessa was engaged. His name was Preston Ashford, and my mother said the last name the way some people say a Bible verse. The Ashfords, Julia. They're important people. I was in my office when she called, standing at the window over the loading dock, watching a van pull out for a food plant run. I said congratulations. I meant it. Whatever Vanessa was to my mother, she was still my little sister, and I'd changed her diapers before I could drive. My mother launched into the plans, the engagement dinner, the restaurant, the guest list, and somewhere under all of it I heard the old thing wake up in my chest. The hope. The stupid, patient hope that this time, in front of these important people, my mother might just say the word daughter and leave it clean. No qualifier, No other. Just mine. I hated that the hope still worked. 10 years of being edited, and I still leaned toward her voice like a plant toward a cracked window. Wear something appropriate, she said. Not one of your work things. I told her I owned dresses. She said, you know what I mean. Then, right before she hung up, almost cheerful about it. And Julia, let's not get into work talk that night. It isn't that kind of crowd. I stood there with the phone warm against my ear after she was gone, watching my own van disappear around the corner, and I said yes to the empty line. Yes to the dress. Yes to the dinner. Yes. Without knowing yet that the crowd she was so worried about impressing already had my name in a contract folder. She called back 2 days later, which is how I knew the first ask hadn't been enough for her. My mother never leaves a thing alone once she's decided it's a threat. I've been thinking, she said, and I braced, because nothing good ever followed my mother thinking. She wanted to know what she should tell people I did if it came up. Not what I did. What she should tell them. Maybe office management, she offered. Or that you're between things. The Ashfords run in real circles, Julia. Real ones. There it was, laid out plain on the kitchen table of our conversation. My whole life, reduced to a cover story she could recite without flinching. And here is the part I'm not proud of. I could have said no. I could have told her exactly what I ran and how many families ate because of it. Instead, I heard myself say, fine, office management, because I wanted one good night. Because Vanessa deserved a dinner that didn't turn into a scene. Because I had gotten very, very good at making myself smaller so a room could stay comfortable. My grandmother would have had words for me. She'd have had a look first, and then the words. But my grandmother wasn't there to give me either one. So I agreed to disappear a little at my own sister's engagement dinner, and I told myself it was generosity. It wasn't. It was a habit wearing generosity's coat. Thank you, my mother said, warm now that I'd folded. You'll see. It'll be a lovely evening. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my office, surrounded by the proof of everything I'd built, having just promised to pretend none of it was mine. I drove down the weekend before to drop off Vanessa's engagement gift, and I got the temperature of the house right away. My father, Gerald, was in his chair with the game on low. He looked up, said, "Hey, kiddo," and looked back at the screen. That was the whole reunion. My dad long ago decided I was a chapter he'd finished reading. He didn't fight my mother about me, he just stopped asking questions. And a man who stops asking questions about his daughter has given up on her in the only way that counts. Nobody in that living room wanted to know about my life. Vanessa breezed through talking about centerpieces and the Ashfords summer place. My mother hovered, refilling a candy dish that didn't need refilling, straightening a picture frame that was already straight. I watched her hands move, and I saw something under the busywork. A brittleness, a fear that the whole set might come crashing if she stopped propping it. On the mantel there was an old photograph I'd seen 1,000 times and never really looked at. A young Sharon, maybe 15, stiff in a church dress. And behind her, half out of frame, a woman in a gray cleaner's smock with her hair tied back and her hands red from work. My grandmother, Ruth. My mother had cropped her own mother nearly out of her own childhood and left just enough of her in to prove the scissors had slipped. I stood in front of that picture longer than I should have. Vanessa asked what I was staring at. Nothing, I said. But it wasn't nothing. It was the whole shape of us, hanging on the wall in a cheap gold frame, and none of them could see it. That night I stayed at a motel off Route 9 rather than under my parents' roof, and I took the brass key out of my bag and set it on the nightstand, the way I do when I need her. My grandmother passed 14 months ago now, 81 years old, and she worked with those hands until nearly the end of them. When I was a teenager, Ruth cleaned offices at night. A law firm, an insurance building, a medical suite on the 3rd floor of a place that smelled like cold coffee and floor wax. My mother would have died before she told a soul her mother scrubbed toilets for a living. But Ruth wasn't ashamed of a single hour of it. She'd take me along on the weekends, hand me a spray bottle, and show me how to do a thing all the way instead of most of the way. "There's no shame in a clean floor, Julia," she'd say. The shame's in the people too good to notice one. She was the only adult in my whole childhood who talked to me like I'd amount to something. Not despite the work. Because of it. She saw a business in me before I saw it in myself. Saw that I liked the order of it. The fixing. The way a wrecked room could be made right by somebody willing. My mother looked at that same work and saw a smell she'd spent her life trying to wash off. My grandmother looked at it and saw me. I turned the key over on the nightstand. Cheap brass, worn smooth on one side from her thumb. It didn't open anything anymore. It opened everything that mattered. And it was the only inheritance I ever wanted. The key came to me the summer I turned 19. Ruth had been trusted to lock up the law firm herself. The whole floor. Which for her was a promotion the size of a knighthood. One night she pressed the spare into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "This one's yours now," she said. "You lock up. I'm going to sit." I about cried. It was a copied brass key to an office I didn't own, and it felt like being handed the deed to the world. She watched me work the lock, and she said the thing I've carried ever since. "Work with your hands, Julia, and nobody can spell it like a curse." Then she added the part people forget. The practical part. Because Ruth was never soft without also being right. They'll respect the paycheck long before they respect the hands, so don't you wait on them. You build the thing. Let them catch up or not. 5 years later, I bought my first used van with money I'd saved scrubbing on my own, and Meridian was a name on a magnet before it was a name on a building. Ruth co-signed the loan I couldn't get a loan. She believed me in dollars, not just words, which is the only kind of belief that ever actually costs anything. When people ask how a girl with no degree built what I built, the honest answer is that one person refused to be embarrassed by me, and it turned out one was enough to start. She saw me from day one. She was also for a very long time, the only one. And now she was gone, and I was about to walk into a dinner and let her daughter erase us both. The night of the dinner, I stood in a motel bathroom and picked the plainer of the two dresses I'd brought. Not because I couldn't wear better, because I'd learned that outshining Vanessa cost me more than it was worth, and some reflex still made me dim myself before I walked into my mother's light. I put my hair up simple. I put Ruth's key in my clutch, where I keep it. I looked at a woman in a mirror who ran a company most of that restaurant's guests couldn't have run for a week, and I coached her to be quiet about it. Then I drove across town to be introduced as somebody's cautionary tale. Let me stop here for a second. If you have ever put on a nice dress to walk into a room that already decided who you are, if you've done that drive, gripping the wheel, rehearsing how small you'll make yourself so nobody's uncomfortable, then you know exactly what that parking lot felt like. Stay with me, because what happened at that table is the reason I finally stopped taking it. Comment "been there" if you've made that drive, and subscribe so you can see how it turns out. I sat in the car for a minute before I went in. I didn't know the Ashfords. I'd never met a single one of them. But as it turned out, one of them knew me better than my own mother ever bothered to. The restaurant was the nicest one in town, which meant it was the one my mother mentioned most often. White cloths, low lights, a hostess who called everyone "your party." Vanessa was already glowing at the center of the table when I came in, and Preston stood to shake my hand, which surprised me. He was tall and easy and a little nervous, the way a decent man is when he's marrying into weather he doesn't understand. "You must be Julia," he said. "Vanessa talks about you." I doubted that, but I liked that he'd lied kindly. My mother swept in from the direction of the ladies' room, took one look at me, and did the thing she does. The fast up and down, pricing the dress, checking the hair, deciding I would pass. She seated me at the far end, past two empty chairs reserved for the Ashfords, which put me as close to the kitchen door as you could get without carrying plates. Nobody introduced me to the extended guests. When Preston tried to ask what I did, my mother's hand landed on his forearm like a bird on a wire. "Oh, Julia's just getting herself settled," she said, smiling. "Let's not put her on the spot." I watched her answer a question that had been asked of me, about me, and I said nothing. And the old numbness came up like a tide I knew the schedule of. The chairs beside me stayed empty. Somewhere in the parking lot, headlights were pulling in. I didn't know it yet, but the two people about to fill those seats were the only ones in that restaurant who'd say my full name out loud that night, and mean every letter of it. Vanessa found a moment while the waiter poured water to lean toward me, still smiling for the room, and drop her voice under the clink of the pitcher. "Please don't be weird tonight," she said. "These are Preston's people. Just let Mom do the talking." I told her I hadn't planned on giving a speech. She laughed, but it had an edge she wanted me to feel. "You know what I mean. No mop stories." Mop stories. That was my life, filed under a joke she'd told so many times she'd forgotten it was ever cruel. I looked at my little sister in her beautiful dress, 28 years old, engaged to a good family, and I understood something with no anger in it at all. She wasn't cruel because she hated me. She was cruel because our mother had built a ladder in that house with exactly 2 rungs, and Vanessa's whole life depended on me staying below her on it. Push me down, stay up. It was the family sport. She'd learned it at the dinner table like table manners. "I won't embarrass you," I said, and I meant it, which was its own small tragedy. I had 91 people on payroll that month. I'd made a decision that week that would keep a food plant running through a recall scare, which meant families in 3 counties kept their jobs. And I was sitting at a white tablecloth being coached, by my baby sister, not to embarrass anyone. I turned Ruth's key over once inside my clutch, under the table, where nobody could see. It was cool, and then it was warm from my hand. "Just get to dessert," I told myself. "You've survived worse rooms than this." I had no idea the room was about to survive me. My mother couldn't stop talking about the Ashfords, so I got the full briefing whether I wanted it or not. The father, Robert, was retired money. Banks. Something clean and quiet. And the mother. "Catherine practically runs the hospital system," my mother said, glowing, refolding her napkin for the 3rd time. "Cascade. All of it. Chief Operating Officer, if you please. Can you imagine?" I could imagine. I could imagine it in more detail than anyone at that table, because I had stood in Catherine Ashford's boardroom 8 months earlier and shaken her hand across a table with my company's name on the folder between us. Cascade Regional Health, 9 facilities, a $4 million master sanitation contract that my crews had been running since the ink dried. I knew the color of the carpet in the office where Catherine Ashford signed. I knew the smell of the coffee she served. And I sat there at my sister's engagement dinner, and I let my mother explain to me who Catherine Ashford was, and I said, "She sounds impressive," like a woman meeting the name for the first time. The dramatic irony of it pressed on my chest like a hand. Everyone at that table thought the Ashfords were arriving to inspect us. Only I knew that one of them had already inspected my life's work, up close, on her own turf, and hired it on the spot. My mother was worried sick that Catherine Ashford might find out her daughter cleaned. Catherine Ashford already knew a Merrick cleaned. She just didn't know yet that the Merrick she'd hired and the Merrick being hidden were the same woman. 2 chairs down and 1 revelation away, the whole evening was sitting on a fault line, and my mother was standing right on the crack. My mother caught me by the elbow on my way back from the restroom, in the narrow hall by the coat check where the noise dropped away. Her grip was harder than her voice. "Tonight of all nights," she said, quiet and fast. "You understand me? Not a word about the cleaning. Catherine Ashford is not the sort of woman who'd understand our family having that in it. That in it. Like I was a stain she'd been managing for years, and tonight was the inspection. I should have pulled my arm back. I should have said the true thing right there in the hallway where it was just the 2 of us. Instead, I looked at her hand on my elbow, and I saw it was trembling. Not with anger. With fear. And for 1 second my mother's face slipped, and I saw all the way down to the bottom of her. "You don't know what it's like," she said, almost to herself, "to have people look at you like you're the help." And I understood her then, more than I ever had. She'd been the help's daughter. She'd been the girl at school whose mother came in the side door with a bucket. She'd spent 40 years scrubbing the smell of ammonia out of her own story, and she'd raised a daughter who walked around soaked in it on purpose. Her shame wasn't about me. It never had been. It was an old wound she was still bleeding from, and she'd decided I was the knife. I felt sorry for her. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I felt genuinely, achingly sorry for her, standing in that hallway with her hand shaking on my arm. And then I nodded and promised to stay hidden, which is the part I'd have to answer for. I went back to my seat at the far end of the table and I did the thing I always do when the ground gets soft. I found the key. It was in my clutch where it lives, cool brass warming to my fingers, worn smooth on the one side where Ruth's thumb wrote it for 30 years. I held it under the tablecloth, and I let it steady me. And I made a decision. The small, quiet kind that feels like nothing and turns out to be everything. I decided to keep the promise. One more time, for Vanessa. For one lovely evening that wasn't about me, I'd stay office management, I'd stay between things. I'd let my mother narrate her comfortable version of her family, and I'd get in my car at the end and drive 2 hours north to the life that was actually mine, and I'd call it generosity one more time. That key had opened a law office when I was 19, and it hadn't opened a single lock since, but it had opened me over and over. Every time I forgot who I was, it reminded me. Ruth's voice came up under the restaurant noise, clear as if she'd pulled out the empty chair beside me. Work with your hands, Julia, and nobody can spell it like a curse. I almost smiled. Not tonight, Grandma, I told her. Tonight I let them spell it. Tonight I just get to dessert. I set the key back in my clutch and folded my napkin over my lap, and I did not know, I could not have known, that the front door of the restaurant had just opened, and that the woman walking through it with a warm smile and no idea what she'd walked into was about to make keeping that promise impossible. Remember the key. It comes back. Catherine Ashford did not arrive the way my mother arrived at things. There was no sweep, no scan of the room to see who was watching. She came in with her husband a half step behind her, apologized to the whole table for the traffic on the interstate, and sat down like a woman who had nothing left to prove to anyone. That's the thing about real weight. It doesn't announce. My mother, by contrast, transformed. Her voice climbed half an octave into its company register. She laughed at things that weren't jokes. She called Catherine Catherine twice in one sentence, the way you say a word you're afraid of losing. And I sat at the far end, angled behind a floral arrangement my mother had probably requested to be exactly that tall, and I watched the two versions of power sit down across from each other. One had spent the evening performing. One had spent a career doing. Catherine was gracious to everyone, asked Vanessa real questions about the wedding, laughed easily at Preston. Then, midway through the introductions, her eyes moved down the table and passed over me, and I saw them catch. Just a flicker. A small snag, the kind you feel when a face is familiar, but the setting is wrong. A coworker in a grocery store, a stranger who is not a stranger. Her head tilted a quarter inch. I looked down at my water glass. And right then my mother lifted her own glass to propose a toast, and the whole table turned toward her, and Catherine's attention went with it. The flicker passed. Not extinguished. Postponed. I let out a breath I'd been holding since she sat down and thought, foolishly, that I'd gotten away with it. I had about 20 minutes left of getting away with it. The dinner went on the way my mother wanted it to, which meant it was about the right things. The venue they'd almost booked. The people who'd be there. Whether the country club's new chef was an improvement. My mother steered every current toward the shore of appearances, and I watched Catherine Ashford navigate it with a politeness that had a floor under it. She asked, at one point, what the wedding colors would mean to the family. A real question. Curious. Generous. My mother answered with a brand of florist. Catherine nodded and let it go, but I caught the small recalibration behind her eyes, the quiet filing away that people who read rooms for a living can't help doing. She was learning exactly who my mother was, one answer at a time, and my mother thought she was dazzling her. I kept my head down and my mouth shut, and I sweated through the promise. Every time the conversation drifted anywhere near jobs, careers, what anybody did all day, my stomach dropped to floor. Because it wasn't a question of whether Catherine Ashford would place me, It was a question of when. She'd stood across a table from me and shaken my hand. You don't fully unremember a face that hired you. It was coming. I could feel it coming the way you feel weather change in an old injury. And the worst part, the part that still makes me shake my head, is that I spent those 20 minutes not bracing to be revealed, but hoping to stay hidden. I had built something Catherine Ashford respected enough to pay millions for, and I sat at my own family's table praying she wouldn't notice me. That's what 10 years of my mother's voice will do. That's the size of the hole I'd been living in. Somewhere around the entrees, my mother got confident, and confident is when she gets cruel, without noticing she's doing it. She started comparing her daughters out loud for the Ashfords' benefit, the way some women show off good china. Vanessa's real career, Vanessa's ambition, Vanessa's bright future in a real field. Each compliment to my sister was built on a quiet floor made of me. Not everyone's a go-getter, she said at one point, with a fond little laugh in my direction, inviting the table to be gently amused by whatever I was. We can't all be ambitious. I felt the heat climb my neck. Not everyone's a go-getter. To a table that included the chief operating officer of a 9-hospital system that ran on a contract I'd won. I kept my hands still in my lap. I kept my face pleasant. Every principal I had told me to sit there and take it, because I'd promised, because it was Vanessa's night, because Ruth had taught me to build the thing and let them catch up. But something under the principals had started to hum, low and steady, a frequency I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, exactly. Anger I knew how to swallow. This was older. This was the feeling of watching someone stand on your grandmother's grave to look taller, and calling it a toast. Preston shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. He'd caught the meanness even if his mother's face gave nothing away. My mother, encouraged by the silence she mistook for agreement, reached for her glass again. She was building toward something. I could see her lining it up. The introduction she thought would be so tastefully humble, the one she'd been rehearsing since the invitation. She just didn't know it was the last thing she'd ever get to say about me unanswered. It was Preston, bless him, who lit the fuse without knowing there was one. He was trying to pull me into the evening, to fix the little cruelty he'd felt pass over me. He turned down the table, past the tall flowers, and said, "Julia, forgive me. I don't think I ever heard what you do. You're in facilities, right? I think Vanessa mentioned." He said it warmly. He said it to include me, and I watched my mother's face do a thing I'll remember to my last day. She lunged for it. She got in front of the word facilities like it was rolling toward a cliff, and she was the only one who could stop it. "Oh, she cleans," my mother said, quick and light, patting the air. "Houses, mostly. It's honest work, I suppose." I suppose. That little throwaway phrase doing the work of a slammed door. But it was too late, because Catherine Ashford's head had already turned. Facilities. The word had snagged on something in her, the way my face had snagged 20 minutes before, and now the two snags were finding each other. She set down her fork. She looked at me. Really looked. The way you look when a shape is finally resolving into a name. "Facilities," Catherine said. Not a question exactly. A tug on a thread. My mother, hearing danger in a place she didn't expect it, doubled down brighter. "Just a little cleaning business," she said. "You know how it is." Catherine did not look away from me. The table had gone the particular kind of quiet that comes right before something. I had 1 second, maybe 2, where I could still have laughed it off, still could have said houses, mostly, and let the moment die. I felt the key in my clutch against my knee. And I chose, one last time, to say nothing. My silence gave my mother the opening she'd wanted all night, and she took it like a woman grabbing a railing. She could feel the ground moving, Catherine's stare, the odd hush, Preston's confusion, and her instinct always was to seize the story before anyone else could tell it. If cleaning was going to be on the table in front of Catherine Ashford, then my mother would be the one to frame it, small and safe and finished, before this important woman could think about it too hard. So she smiled the smile she saves for damage control, and she lifted her glass a little, and she gathered the table's attention the way she'd been gathering it her whole life. I knew what was coming. I'd heard versions of it for a decade. I could have stopped her. Even then, that late, I could have set my hand on the table and said my own name and my own work in my own voice, and changed the shape of the next 60 seconds. But I had promised. And more than the promise, I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The specific exhaustion of a person who has spent 10 years choosing everyone's comfort over her own truth and has forgotten the choice is a choice. So I sat there. I let her lift her glass. I let her open her mouth. 10 years of not stopping her, and I couldn't find the muscle to stop her now, at the exact moment it mattered most. She turned to the Ashfords, warm and rehearsed and proud of her own graciousness, and she gestured down the table toward me like a tour guide pointing out a modest local landmark. And then, my mother introduced me, and nothing was ever the same after. "Catherine, Robert, forgive me. I've been rude," my mother said, all silk. "You've met Vanessa, of course, our bride, and this," the gesture, the little tilt of the head, the practiced sigh of a woman being so very gracious about a disappointment. "This is our other daughter, Julia. She cleans houses for a living. Our other daughter." There it was, the word she'd used my whole life, the word that filed me second and apart. The leftover daughter, the one who came with a footnote. She said it the way you'd mention a cousin who'd had some trouble, and Vanessa, God help her, couldn't resist smoothing it into a joke. Couldn't stand a beat of awkward silence without filling it. She laughed her light social laugh and said, "Honestly, Dad's given up on her at this point." A little ripple went around the extended guests, that nervous half-chuckle people give when they're not sure if cruelty is a bit. My father studied his plate. He didn't laugh. He also didn't say a word, and his silence agreed with her louder than a laugh would have. I sat at the end of that table holding my grandmother's key through the fabric of my clutch, and I heard the whole architecture of 10 years land in 2 sentences. "This is our other daughter. Dad's given up on her." My mother lowered her glass, pleased, certain she'd handled it, certain she'd introduced me small enough that no important person would ever have to think about the ammonia in our bloodline. She looked to Catherine Ashford for the gracious nod that would close the subject, and Catherine Ashford did not nod. Catherine Ashford did not smile. Catherine Ashford had gone completely, utterly still. The stillness of a person who has just understood something the rest of the room hasn't caught up to yet. Catherine set her glass down on the white cloth without a sound. She looked at me, straight down the length of that table, past the 2 tall flowers my mother had chosen to keep me out of sight, and she looked at me, the way no one in my family had looked at me in years. Like I was the most important person she'd found in the room. "Wait," she said. Her voice had dropped, gone careful. The voice of someone checking a fact they already know is true. "You're—" And then she stopped herself. You could see her choosing not to say it wrong, not to blurt it, wanting to give the moment its full weight. Because Catherine Ashford was placing me now. All the way. Julia Merrick. Meridian Facility Services. The woman who'd sat across from her 8 months ago and walked her through a sanitation plan for 9 hospitals. The owner. The founder. The name on the $4 million contract that kept the operating rooms in her entire system safe enough to cut people open in. She'd toured a plant with me. She'd watched me answer her infection control director's hardest questions without a note in front of me. And here I was, at the far end of a family dinner, being introduced by my own mother as the daughter who cleaned houses and had been given up on. The whole table locked up. I watched it happen in real time, that ripple of confusion moving person to person. Vanessa's smile faltering, Preston looking between his mother and me, my father's head coming up at last, and my mother. My mother's face, which had been so warm and so certain 30 seconds ago, began to lose its color from the top down, like water draining out of a glass. She didn't understand yet what was happening. She only understood that something was, and that for the first time all night it was happening to her. Catherine didn't reach for the drama of it. That's what I keep coming back to. A lesser person, handed that moment, would have made a spectacle. Pointed. Announced. Let the whole restaurant hear. Catherine just turned to my mother and my sister with a small, almost puzzled courtesy, and she said, "You'll have to forgive me. I don't think you all know who's sitting with you tonight." She didn't say it to wound. She said it the way you'd gently correct someone about to sit in a wet chair. Then she looked back at me, and something in her whole bearing shifted into deference. Not pity, not performance, but the plain professional respect of one serious woman recognizing another. "It's good to see you, Ms. Merrick," she said, "though I'll admit this is not where I expected to." My mother's mouth opened and produced nothing. Vanessa said, "I'm sorry. You two know each other?" In a voice that had lost all its earlier confidence. And for the first time in the entire evening, in 10 years of evenings, nobody at that table was talking over me, around me, or for me. The flowers didn't matter anymore. The far seat didn't matter. The whole center of gravity of the room had quietly slid down to my end of the table and settled in the empty space my mother had built around me to keep me small. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't said a single word yet. Catherine Ashford had simply refused to accept a false frame, and the false frame was collapsing on its own, taking a decade of my mother's careful story down with it. I felt the key against my knee. I felt something in my chest I hadn't felt in years, and it took me a moment to name it. It was room. I finally had room. My mother recovered the only way she knew how, by grabbing for the story again, this time from the other direction. Color came back into her face in blotches as the math started working behind her eyes. If Catherine Ashford respected Julia, then Julia was suddenly worth claiming. It was that fast. It was that shameless. "Well, of course," my mother said, laughing a thin, unsteady laugh. "Of course we're so proud of Julia. She's done ever so well for herself. We always knew she would. Didn't we, Gerald?" And she reached across two people to touch my arm, to fold me back into the family, now that the family was the thing that looked good. My arm. The same arm she'd gripped in the coat check hallway an hour ago, telling me to stay hidden. Now she was pulling me into the light with the exact same hand. And here is where it got cruel in a way she'll never understand. She was cruel. Because what she was offering me, in that grasping, panicked moment, was the only thing I had ever wanted from her. To be claimed. To be hers. Out loud, in front of important people, with pride instead of apology. 10 years I'd driven 2 hours south hoping for that sentence. And she was finally saying it. "We're so proud of Julia." And she was only saying it because a rich woman had made me valuable. My whole life's wish, handed to me at the exact instant I could see the price tag on it. I looked at my mother's hand on my arm. I looked at Catherine waiting, and Vanessa lost. And my father finally, actually watching me. And I understood I was standing at a fork I'd been walking toward for 10 years without knowing it was there. 3 roads. I saw all 3 of them at once, clear as exit signs. The first road was the one everybody at that table half expected me to take, and God, it was tempting. One sentence. I could turn to Catherine and say, kindly, that Cascade's operating rooms stayed sterile because of my cruise, that the contract my mother was so afraid of came from this woman's own system, and I could watch my mother's standing with the Ashfords evaporate in front of the people she most wanted to impress. Revenge, clean, and total. She'd handed me the knife herself. The second road was the one I'd taken 1,000 times. Smile. Shrink. "Oh, Mom's too kind, it's a small thing, really." Fold myself back down to a size that kept the peace, protected Vanessa's night, let my mother save face, and drove home 2 hours later with the old numbness for company. The good daughter's road. The invisible road. And the third road I couldn't quite see the end of, which is how I knew it was the real one. I turned Ruth's key over in my clutch, one slow rotation, brass gone warm as a live thing. "Work with your hands, Julia, and nobody can spell it like a curse." She hadn't taught me to take the knife. She hadn't taught me to disappear. She'd taught me to build the thing and say so plainly and let them catch up or not. 10 years I'd chosen the second road, the shrinking one, telling myself it was love. My grandmother's key was warm in my hand, and I finally understood. Standing at the fork with my mother's fingers on my arm and a whole table waiting. Exactly what she'd been trying to tell me since I was 19 years old. I set my napkin on the table. Just that. A small thing, a white square of cloth laid down beside my plate. And yet I felt the whole shape of my life hinge on it, because setting that napkin down meant I was not going to reach back up and catch my mother's story before it fell. For 10 years, catching her story had been my job, the invisible labor of the family, the daughter who absorbed the awkwardness so no one else had to feel it. I was the load-bearing wall. Everyone leaned on my silence and called the house standing proof that nothing was wrong, and I was about to walk out from under the weight and let them all feel how much I'd been holding. My mother's eyes found mine, and I saw the plea in them, naked and desperate. Fix this. Make it go away. Be small so I can be safe. She'd worn that look my whole life, and I'd answered it my whole life. Save me, Julia. I had saved her 1,000 times. I'd saved her in that graduation party, and in 100 hallways, and 30 seconds ago, I could have saved her still. She was my mother. Some part of me will always want to save her. But I looked at her shaking, draining face, and I looked at the empty chair where my grandmother should have been, and I made the choice that ended one life and started another. Not tonight. I did not pick up the napkin. I stood up instead. Slowly, calmly. No scene, no heat. And the whole table turned to watch the other daughter get to her feet. And once I was standing, there was no sitting back down into who I'd been. I didn't raise my voice. I want that on the record because my mother spent years telling people I was the dramatic one, and there was nothing dramatic in what I did. I stood at the end of that table, and I spoke plainly, the way Ruth taught me to do everything. All the way. Not most of the way. Catherine, it's good to see you too, I said. For everyone who doesn't know, Mrs. Ashford and I have worked together for the better part of a year. Then I looked around the table, at Preston and my father and the confused extended guests, and I told them the truth I'd let my mother edit for a decade. I own a company called Meridian Facility Services. I started it 10 years ago with a used van and about $400. Today we have around 90 people, and we keep hospitals and food plants clean enough to be safe. Operating rooms, sterile production lines, the places where a missed corner can cost somebody their life. I kept my voice even. Mrs. Ashford's hospital system is one of our clients, so when my mother tells you I clean, she's right. I clean. I built an entire company out of cleaning, and there are 90 families who eat because I did. Nobody moved. Preston's mouth had come open. Vanessa was staring at me like she'd never seen me before, which I realized. She never really had. And I did not say the one sentence that would have destroyed my mother. I never mentioned that the contract she'd been so terrified of was the very thing that had just made me respectable in her eyes. I left that knife on the table where she'd set it. I didn't need it. I turned, finally, to my mother, who had gone white and small and silent, all her narration spent. And I said the thing my grandmother had been waiting 30 years for one of us to say out loud. My mother, even then, tried to take the win. See? She said faintly, reaching for the wreckage of her story. We always knew. We're so proud. And I stopped her. Not sharply, but the way you stop a door from slamming, with a flat and gentle hand. No, Mom, I said. You don't get to be proud of me tonight because Catherine Ashford is impressed. You had 10 years to be proud of me for free. The table was silent enough to hear the kitchen behind the door. You can be ashamed of me, or you can be right about me, I said. You don't get both. I watched that land on her like weather, and then I said the rest of it, quietly, because it wasn't for the room. It was for her, and for the woman in the gray smock cropped out of the photograph on her mantel. My grandmother cleaned offices for 30 years, and you spent your whole life trying to scrub her out of your story. You couldn't even leave her in a picture, and when I turned out to have her hands instead of yours, you tried to scrub me out too. But I stopped being the other anything the day she handed me that key. I reached into my clutch, and I set Ruth's brass key on the white tablecloth, right in the center where the candlelight caught it, and I let them all look at it. "I love you," I said, and I meant it, which was the hardest part. "But I'm not going to sit at a table that needs me hidden to feel comfortable. Not anymore." Then I turned to Catherine and sincerely, and I bent and kissed my sister's cheek. Vanessa was crying, though I couldn't tell you for whom, and I wished her a real marriage. The honest kind. The kind that doesn't need a cover story. And I picked my grandmother's key back up off the table, and I left. I got everything I'd driven 2 hours to get. I just had to leave it all on the table to carry it out the door. The parking lot air hit me like a cold cloth, and I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the sheer size of what I'd just set down. 10 years is heavy. You don't notice until you put it on the ground. I was standing by my car breathing when the restaurant door opened behind me, and it was Preston, of all people, jogging out with his jacket half on. "Ms. Merrick, Julia, wait." He stopped a polite distance away, looking like a man who'd learned something about the family he was marrying into and didn't love it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. That was—" He shook his head, unable to find a word clean enough. "That wasn't right. And I didn't do anything to stop it, so I'm sorry twice." I told him he didn't marry the mother and that Vanessa might surprise us both if given the chance, and I found I actually believed it. Then the door opened again, and Catherine Ashford came out, unhurried, pulling her wrap around her shoulders. She didn't offer me pity. She didn't offer me business either, which I respected more than I can say. She just stopped in front of me and looked at me for a moment. "I've hired a lot of contractors in 30 years, she said. "Yours were always the best crews I'd ever had in my buildings, and I could never quite figure out why." She almost smiled. "Now I know. They work for someone who knows what the work is worth." She said goodnight and went to find her husband, and I stood in that parking lot between two people who'd known me for less than a year and had seen me more clearly than the family inside had managed in 34. My phone lit up in my hand, a text from Vanessa. I didn't read the text right away. I got in my car first, and I sat there in the dark with my hands on the wheel, and I let myself understand what had just happened, because I knew if I drove off too fast I'd lose it. For 10 years I had called my silence love. I'd driven 2 hours south, again and again, and let my mother spell me like a curse, and told myself that swallowing it made me the bigger person, the good daughter, the peacekeeper. It didn't. It made me complicit in my own erasure. Every time I'd stayed quiet to keep a room comfortable, I hadn't been giving my family a gift. I'd been paying a tax on a belonging that was never actually on offer. Not to the real me, only to the small quiet ghost I'd agreed to be at their table. The shame had never been mine to carry. It was my mother's, an old wound she'd handed down like a family recipe, and I'd taken it and worn it and mistaken the weight of it for love. Ruth had tried to tell me. She hadn't waited for anyone to hand her dignity, because she understood it was never theirs to give in the first place. You don't ask permission to respect your own hands. I felt the grief of the whole thing, the 10 wasted years, the mother I'd never quite have. But underneath the grief was something lighter than I'd carried in a decade, and I sat with both of them, the loss and the lightness, because they'd arrived together and I think they were always going to. Nobody can spell it like a curse. Not the whole town. Not even my mother. Not anymore. Then I picked up my phone and read what my sister had sent. Vanessa's text wasn't an apology. It was better than an apology, because it was honest. "Did you really build all that?" That was all. A real question. Maybe the first one my sister had ever asked me about my actual life. I wrote back that I had, and that I'd show her sometime if she wanted, and she wrote back okay. And then, a minute later, I didn't know. I believed her. She'd been handed the family story same as me. She'd just been handed the flattering end of it. My mother called 3 days later. Not to apologize. My mother has never once apologized, and I've made my peace with the fact that she probably never will. She called to manage the optics. People are asking questions, she said stiffly. The Ashfords. Can you at least come to the wedding and be normal about all this? I told her I would come to Vanessa's wedding gladly, as myself, as the owner of Meridian, and that I'd be warm to everyone and hide from no one. And if that wasn't normal enough for her, she was welcome not to send the invitation. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, I don't know how to do that, and hung up. And I think it was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. My father texted too, later that same week. Just one line. Your grandmother would have been proud of you. I wasn't ever brave like her. I'm sorry, kiddo. It didn't fix anything. But I saved it. A few weeks later, I was walking a Cascade Hospital wing at 5 in the morning again, the floors gleaming under the nightlights, my crew finishing the last corridor before the day shift woke the place up. Catherine Ashford renewed our contract that spring and added 2 facilities, and she did it on the numbers, not on charity, which is the only way I'd have taken it. I mounted my grandmother's brass key by the front door of Meridian's office, in a little frame, over a small brass plate that says the only company motto I've ever needed. We built it clean. My people walk past it every morning. Some of them ask about it. I tell them about a woman in a gray smock who wasn't ashamed of a single hour, and about a key to a law office she didn't own that turned out to open everything that mattered. Vanessa took me up on the tour. She stood in the doorway of a food plant in a hairnet and safety glasses and watched a line my crews kept spotless, and she cried a little again, and this time, I knew who for. She got married that summer. I came as myself. My mother is still my mother. She edits, she performs, she reaches for the family that looks good in a given light. I didn't fix her. You can't. But I broke the thing she tried to hand down, and it stops with me. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's narrow idea of who you're allowed to be, and the shame they keep trying to hand you was never once yours to carry. That's my story. 10 years of being edited down to a footnote, undone by the word other, and one worn brass key that finally set me straight. If there's someone in your life who keeps spelling your work like a curse, take this as your sign to stop translating yourself smaller for their comfort. You built it. Say so plainly and let them catch up or not. If this reached you tonight, share it with a woman who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.